Good afternoon, and welcome to Global Hotspots. My name is Wiley Norton. I'm a program manager with the Wisconsin Foundation and Alumni Association. Global Hotspots, as you know, is one of our free alumni learning programs that takes you behind the scenes of today's top news stories with UW faculty experts. It's sponsored by the Wisconsin Alumni Association, as well as the UW Madison International Division and Plato. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Professor Hernando Rojas. Professor Rojas is the Helen, Firstbrook Franklin Professor of Journalism, the Director of Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies program, and the Director of Graduate Studies with the School of Journalism and Mass Communication. His scholarship focuses on political communication, in particular examining three different things: the deployment of new communication technologies. Sorry about that. New communication technologies for social mobilization in a variety of contexts, the influence of audience perceptions of media, and the conditions under which media support democratic governance. All very appropriate things for this day and age. So ladies and gentlemen, my pleasure to welcome Professor Rojas.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Is the volume fine? Are you in the back? Okay. So I teach a very large introductory class, an introduction to communication, about 340 students, and just like you, the freshmen will always sit at the back. And only if you're late will you end up in these front row seats. It's my pleasure to be here. Today I'm going to be focusing this talk on political culture and how the potential shifts in political culture have affected recent political events. An alternative title to this presentation was, "Why did Trump win?" But I will keep that for the end of the talk. So let me start by doing a very brief summary of the notion of political culture and civic culture in particular. So back in the 60s, political scientists Gabriel Ellman and Sidney Verva started a very prolific career in political science. And one of their initial important studies was this study that tried to create a typology about political cultures in the world. It was one of those first comparative pieces in political science that was empirical. And they looked at the US, they looked at Mexico, they looked at Italy, they looked at Great Britain, and they were trying to see, well, what are the patterns of political cultures across countries? They ended up suggesting that there's three basic types of political culture, which I've summarized here. One which they named parochial, and a parochial political culture was one in which the political system is not really a separate system, and people therefore do not expect anything of political leaders per se. It's more of a family, clan-based type association. Then they recognized some political cultures that they talked about subject political cultures, in which people were concerned with the outputs of the political system, but they had very little to do or to say in terms of the inputs. So think about a kingdom. So I might be happy or sad about the king that I have, but there's very little I can do in terms of selecting the king, right? And so I might be worried about the outputs of the system. I have very little to do with the inputs. And then they talked about a participant political culture in which citizens, no longer subjects, were oriented both to the outputs, what is government doing for me, but also to the inputs. What is the type of government that I want? What are the types of leaders that I want? What are the types of issues that I want addressed? When they try to classify countries within this typology, of course, typologies are sometimes good to make us understand ideas, but then they're messy when you try to actually fit the world into them. They realized that the US culture was sort of a participant culture, but more what they described as a civic culture. And what they meant by that was a hybrid in which citizens would have a lot to say in terms of inputs, selecting government, selecting issues that they cared about, but then sort of stepping back and trusting government to do the right thing. And so if you think about participation in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and of course there were moments, right? There were moments in which people trusted the government more or trusted the government less. But even in moments in which the government, a particular government was trusted less, there were high degrees of trust in institutions overall, high degrees of trust in democracy as a form of government. In this civic culture, Alman and Verva argued, the most important function of it is to moderate change. It permits change, it allows for change, but you don't need a revolution for change. You can actually manage change based on persuasion and based on communication and getting people to accept your ideas and enact change. Within the logic of the 60s, Alman and Verva concluded that the US was the ideal type, and that over time, countries like Mexico, countries like Italy, would become more like the US. They would enable, or they would develop, to use the language of the era, political institutions, and they would develop a civic culture. Now, today what I want to show you is a study that we've been conducting with a group of scholars in Mexico, in Colombia, in Brazil, and in the US, in which we went back and took some of the questions that Alman and Verva had posited in the 60s, and in 2016, so last year in April, we asked those same questions again to try to see how culture has changed over time, also looking at the US and Mexico, which had been part of the original study, and including some additional Latin American countries, in this case, Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil. Today I'm going to show you a little bit of what we found in this study. I'm going to be talking a little bit about how people orient themselves towards communication in these systems, how they orient themselves towards government, towards their fellow citizens, and then we'll talk at the end of trying to answer this question, is civic culture dead, and the potential implications of that. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time in telling you about the design of the studies. If somebody wants some of the technical aspects, we can talk about that in the Q&A part. These were random samples to represent the adult populations of these countries. We hired a company called Survey Sampling International, and they did the surveying for us in all these countries. About 500 people, 500 per country. And so let's see at some of the things that we found. And so let's start with this notion of orientation towards communication. I'm going to walk you through quite a bit of data, but I think I've presented it in a way that is easy to follow. So this was 1959 when Alman and Verva did their survey. So this is coming right out of their book. And they were asking people, how often do you follow public affairs? And the response categories were never, time to time, or regularly. So we replicated exactly that question wording that they had used. So look at the big differences between Mexico and the US in 1959. So 44% of people in Mexico, so almost half the population, was saying, I never follow public affairs. And only about 15% of the population was saying, I follow it regularly. Compare that to the US, in which you have about 27% of people saying, I follow it regularly, and 53% saying, from time to time. Only 19% are saying, I never. So about 1 in 5 people are saying, I don't follow public affairs at all. Let's fast forward to 2016. As I said, this was April. Different things happening in these countries. So in the US, the primaries were on. In Brazil, impeachment was happening. In Colombia, vote on the peace process. So very different political moments, but all of them of heightened political activity and interest. So look at what happens in 2016. In all these countries that we looked at, most people now, the majority of people in each country are saying, I follow the news regularly. Very few people, 7%, 5%, 4%, 2%, are saying, I never pay attention to public affairs. So when we look at this, this suggests that maybe Allen and Verva were right. Look how these distributions, there's some differences between countries, and those differences might have to do with the specific political moment that country is going through, but the distributions, the shape of the distributions are very similar. So mostly populations that are engaged with public affairs across these four very diverse, very different countries. Another source of information for people about politics beyond media is conversations we have with other people. And so we also looked at that. Do you talk about politics and public affairs with people around you? Mexico in 1959, 61% saying never. So 60% of the people saying, I never talk about politics, compared with 24% of people in the US saying the same, about 1 in 5 saying, I don't talk politics, 76% saying, yeah, sure, I sometimes talk politics. Fast forward to 2016. Very few people not talking politics. So big shifts, big shifts in terms of these Latin American countries that now again, in this regard, look very similar to the US. What happens in terms of our orientations towards government? So it was a question that asked people, does the government have an impact on everyday life? And you could answer, no, it has no effect. It has some effect. It has great effect. Look at this difference here. In 1959, 66% of Mexicans thought the government had no effect in their life. So 2 out of 3 Mexicans thought what the government does not affect my everyday life, compared with only 11% of people in the US who thought that. Most people in the US thought it had some effect at least, or a great effect. When we move to 2016, we now see very similar distributions. So the US, this increased somewhat, the people in the middle saying it has some effect, right? So it was 44, went up to 55. But the distributions is between 9% and 18% of people that say, no, the government doesn't really have an effect on my life. Most people thinking that it either has some effect or a great effect. Of course, we don't know if people are saying this is a good effect or a bad effect. And so let's take a look at that. In 1959 in Mexico, 19% of people thought they would be better out without a government. So about 1 in 5, compared to 3% of people in the US. 2% were saying, I see no difference if there's a government or not. 1% in the US. And then 19% in the US and 76% saying the government improves people's conditions. And this is, well, sometimes the government does the right thing, sometimes it doesn't. But huge discrepancy. I mean, even though also in Mexico, 58% of people are saying, yes, it improves conditions, there's 1 in 5 saying, no, it doesn't, or we'd be better off without a government. This has also changed dramatically. I'll start with the US. Now only 11% of people thinks that the government improves conditions. Dramatic shift from 76 to 11. Now, what prevails in the US is the notion that sometimes government improves conditions. But I also want to point your attention towards these 2 figures, how they've rated. So now there's 11% of people saying better off without a national government, or 9% of people saying it makes no difference. So about 20%, 1 in 5 Americans now believe that either the government makes no difference or we'd be better off without a national government. The distributions now seem very similar with certain countries. Brazil, for example, 18% of people saying, actually, we're better off without a national government. This was in the middle of corruption scandals that led to the impeachment of the president. Now, how do I expect the government to treat me? If I go to a government official, and they had different questions, if I have to deal with a police officer, if I have to deal with an administration officer, do I expect that I'm going to get equal treatment, it depends, or unequal treatment? Clear difference between the two countries in the 50s, right? So 83% of people in the US thought, I'm gonna get equal treatment. And only about 9% of people thought, I'm gonna get unequal treatment if I deal with authorities, if I deal with the government. In Mexico, very different. 50%, so half the population thought that they would get unequal treatment, or they got unequal treatment when they dealt with government. But now look what has happened. Now only 43% of people in the US think that they will get equal treatment from government agencies or from government officials. Actually, now people in Mexico, in Colombia, and in Brazil actually think that they'll get more equal treatment than people in the US. This doesn't mean that you'll get better treatment, but you'll get equal treatment, right? So these have become more similar, probably not in the way that Almond and Verva envisioned, right? Perceptions of corruption in government. Here I'm not giving you the 1959 values, I'm just giving you 2016. Trust in Congress. This is a 0 to 5 scale. So you're asked to choose, how much do you trust Congress? 0 means you don't trust them at all. 5, you trust them very much. And you see that there's, I'm sorry, not trust, corruption. Is it a corrupt institution? No corruption at all. And what you see is that there's very high levels of perception of corruption in most institutions, particularly Congresses, particularly governments. Still in the US, there's a little bit of more, let's say the opposite of, if you think an institution is corrupt, you don't trust it. So courts do a little better, and the military does somewhat better, as is the case in all these Latin American countries. But in terms of big business, government, and Congress, people perceive high levels of corruption. What about attitudes towards fellow citizens? And so we got at that by asking people, what's the likelihood of the typical American cutting in line, or bribing a police officer, or bribing an official, or bribing a judge? Again, 0 to 5. 5, very likely. 0, not likely at all. And here we see that, again, with probably the exception of cutting in line. So in most of these countries, everybody thinks everybody else is going to cut in line. Some psychologists actually use these measures to say, when we say what we think others are going to do, what we're really saying is what we would do. So some psychologists would interpret that as we're going to cut in line, but we say others will do it. It's some sort of a projective measure. But the point here is, I mean, there's still a difference. There's still an important difference in the US and these 3 countries in terms of citizen trust, if you will, or faith in your fellow citizens. These are high levels compared to the past, but they're still very good compared to these other countries, right? So they're still under the mean in terms of bribing a police for the US, or bribing an official, or bribing a judge. Bribing a police, particularly in Mexico, everybody thinks everybody else is bribing police officers, is bribing judges, is bribing officials. So there's still a repository of trust in other citizens, but that is not as good as it was some decades ago. But there's still an important advantage here. In the past few months or years, a topic that has been hotly debated has been political polarization, and whether we as a country are more politically polarized than we were a few decades back. And I want to pose that question to you. Who thinks that the US today is more politically polarized than it was, let's say, 20 years ago? Please raise your hand. So almost everybody in the room raises their hand. This is a question that I've posed to audiences in Mexico, in Colombia, in Thailand, in Singapore, in Chile, and everywhere I tend to get that same response of, we are more polarized now than we were before. I'll get back to that in a minute. What is political polarization? There's different ways of thinking about this. Some people say, well, political polarization is on issues, we start seeing them differently, and so our positions on those issues start to separate. And so we could take an issue like abortion, and increased polarization on that issue would mean that a group of people starts to move towards the side of, no, this should never be allowed, and another group of people starts to move towards the side of, yes, under any circumstance this should be allowed, and then there's nobody in the middle. And we would refer to that as a polarized society on issues. There's only one problem with that, which is when you look at public opinion in the past 30 or 40 years, issue positions in the US and in many of these countries have remained very stable. About half the people want it, about half the people don't want it, but most people actually are, well, under certain circumstances, yes, under others. So very normal distributions of opinion, rather than what you would expect in a polarized society, which would be two humps, right? So over here, group of people, nobody in the middle, and then over here, another group of people. You don't see that in public opinion polls. They tend to be very normally distributed, and they have been for that way in many, many years. So then, is there political polarization? Some people have said, well, maybe we haven't shifted so much in terms of issues, but what's happening is that we dislike people that do not hold our ideas more than we used to. And so people are talking now of effective political polarization. To use a colloquial term, those who do not belong to our party or who have a different ideology than us, we hate them more than we used to hate them in the past. And there's evidence of that. And so Shanto Iyengar, another famous political scientist, has done a good job of plotting how, according to his research, people today in the US are more concerned that their son or daughter will marry someone from the other political party than they are about them marrying someone from a different race or from a different religion. And so if you think of it effectively, and a lot of it is done through feeling thermometers, for example, so if you're a Democrat, how warm or cold do you feel about Republicans and vice versa? You see the sort of widening of that gap in terms of thinking about that other group. In this particular study, what we did was we measured it by asking people whether those in your party, so we asked the political who did you vote for or what party do you identify with, and then we asked to rate attributes on people from your party and people from other parties. And this is one example. So, are people from your party informed? What about the people from the other party? Are they informed as well? And this was in 1959, the gap between, I think my partisans are informed, the ones from the other party are not. The gap was only 8% in the US, and it was 11% in Mexico. Now look at what has happened for 2016. 50%, there's a 50% gap between people who think that if I'm a Republican, Republicans are informed, Democrats are not. If I'm a Democrat, Democrats are informed, Republicans are not. Huge gap. Particularly striking, the information one, in the US, but prevalent among countries. Of course, it's not only about information. Are they smart? Are the people from the other party smart? Well, the gaps used to be small, 7% in 1959. It's getting bigger. Now there's a 28% gap. So the people from my party are smart, the ones from the other party are not smart. So they are uninformed or unintelligent, or they don't care about the welfare of humanity. So there's a 40% gap. It used to be 14%. So here, whether you were a Democrat or a Republican, you were thinking, well, They have a different way of thinking about how things should be done, but it's not that they don't care. It's just that they think this type of policy versus this other type of policy will be better, as opposed to now in which we think that people from the other party, as I was saying before, are uninformed or unintelligent or don't care about other people. If we summarize this across between intelligence or information or caring about others, we have very similar and substantial gaps between people. So in terms of affection, it is clear that there's been a huge increase in terms of thinking that people who do not think like us are worse. And they're worse because they're uninformed, they're not intelligent, or they don't care. So this brings me to the problem of, is civic culture dead? And so we've seen some of the critical elements of civic culture. I think civic culture, as Alman and Verva understood it, probably is dead, particularly because we are less trusting of others, increasingly less trusting of others, increasingly less trusting of institutions. There's still some elements that remain, so we want to be informed and we want to express ourselves. So I think that civic culture that Alman and Verva were talking about has been replaced by what some refer to as a digital political culture, in which the emphasis is information and expression, yet we're very suspicious of any social structure. This, of course, generates big challenges. I remember giving a conference in Mexico about political values to a very young group of people, and I surveyed them as part of the exercise, and they don't trust corporations, they don't trust businesses, they don't trust unions, they don't trust the government. So any form of organization, they don't trust. In the past, well, if I trusted businesses and not the government, I would say, well, I'm going to vote Republican because if you free things up, businesses will take care. Or if I, on the other hand, was more on the left, I would say, no, I want government and I want government regulation. But there was a logic that there were at least certain institutions that were trustworthy and that we could rely on. Particularly young people today do not trust any institution. This poses a huge challenge. How do you change the political world when you don't trust any form of organization, any form of organization that in the past has been critical for collective action? Some people are starting to reformulate then collective action and say, well, maybe those collective mobilizations of the past based on a shared identity, based on a similar frame, a shared frame, are no longer necessary. And maybe we've entered a world of personalized politics in which I express myself on what's important to me and only to me, and I try to find things in which people coalesce, but we do not necessarily share an identity, we do not necessarily share a message. An anecdotal example of this, if some of you participated in the Women's March a few days ago, if you go to their website, for example, they're providing you with, hey, here's a postcard, fill it. So it's your ideas, it's your slogans. It's not, as was more common 20 or 30 years ago, in which the actual movement would say, well, this is about X, and we all support Y. Now it's much more about what you think is important, and you are participating for that. Again, this creates all kinds of fascinating problems of how do you sustain action, how do you get things done in a world like that. And I think it's a world that opens us up because there are no, and I'm exaggerating when I say there are no intermediary institutions. Yes, we still have political parties. Yes, we still have the media. Yes, we still have a judiciary. But because our trust in those intermediary institutions is diminished or diminishing, it tends to be harder to connect with others and move towards social change. And I think what that does is it opens up issues of manipulation in which it becomes more about a communicative effort and whether you identify with a specific communication type rather than sort of building something that is going to result in public change. So if you want to see the glass half full, communication and therefore common understanding is becoming more and more important, more than institutions per se. If you want to see the glass half empty, that opens you up for being manipulated, right? Because we can talk to understand other people and to make them understand our point of views, or we can talk to manipulate people, right? And there's good strands of research in psychology and communication that teach us how to do that. And this leads me then to the final part of my talk that has to do then with how this might affect, so I've been talking about something that's a little bit, well, yes, political culture, it's changing, but what are the practical consequences of these changes? And I want to talk a little bit about the recent political election in the US to see some of the practical consequences of these shifts in political culture. To the question of why did Trump win, there's been many answers. Some people have talked about sexism. I tend to be a little skeptical of that because Hispanics, 66% of female Hispanics voted for Hillary, 63% of male Hispanics voted for Hillary. So there's a 3% difference. Maybe that 3% difference we can attribute to sexism, but it's not a huge difference. And I use Hispanics as an example because I think, being a Hispanic myself, we're not the most progressive bunch. We're not the most progressive in terms of gender equity and gender equality. Nevertheless, 63% of Hispanic males went and voted for Hillary. So unless you're willing to resort to some kind of theory about how people vote against their interests, or some interests become more prevalent than others, right? So a majority of white females voted for Trump. And so this explanation of, sure, I'm not saying that some people were not motivated by that, but I think it's a simplistic explanation to think that gender explains the election. Some people have talked about racism as well as an explanation, and I'm also a little skeptical of that explanation. And again, yes, some racist movements have actually been sort of energized and mobilized by this current election. And yes, there might be places in which there's structural racism in voting and who gets to vote and who doesn't get to vote. But the claim that some people have made that, well, you know, there's a lot of people there that had racist beliefs and now they're able to express them. I tend to think that that's oversimplifying the problem and over-representing the amount of racism in a society. Again, I'm not trying to say it's not a problem, it doesn't exist. I want to argue that this has more to do with a shift in political culture that I've been describing, and I'm going to show you some elements that I think support this notion of a cultural shift. So first, this is only looking at, so this is, as I said, April, so we're in the primaries. People who voted or intended to vote for the candidates that were left at the time of the election. Hillary, Ted Cruz, John Kasich, Bernie Sanders, and Donald Trump. And what I'm plotting over here is Congress corrupt? 0 to 5, perceptions of corruption in Congress. Now, what I want to show you, well, first of all, so this is a scale from 0 to 5, so everybody's above the middle part of that scale. So most people think that Congress is corrupt, but particularly if you're a Bernie Sanders supporter or a Trump supporter. So these two groups are statistically different from people who voted to Hillary, Ted Cruz, or John Kasich. So everybody, well, and again, when I say everybody, I mean most people tend to think that Congress is corrupt, particularly Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump supporters. It's not just perceptions of corruption in Congress, corruption in the federal government. Again, A lot of people see corruption in the federal government, particularly if you're a Donald Trump, a Bernie Sanders, or a John Kasich supporter. You see less corruption. You're still seeing a lot of corruption, but you see less corruption if you were a Hillary Clinton supporter. How much of a democracy is the United States? This used to be a question that would be asked in most developmental countries around the world. And we were lucky to ask it in this particular one because this has become now an interesting point of debate. This is a scale in which it's from 1 to 4. If you answer if you answer 1, you're saying, if you answer 1, you're saying this is not a democracy. If you answer 4, you're saying this is a full democracy. So the first thing to keep in mind is, again, everyone is below 1.8. So most people are seeing problems with democracy, but particularly Bernie Sanders supporters and Donald Trump supporters do not live in a democracy. In their own minds, this is no longer a democracy. And again, these are statistically different from these other groups over here. Do we live in a country with a free press? Well, no, again, numbers are low, so most people are somewhat skeptical of the press and how free it is and how unbiased it is, and that number grows. So every time, if you look at Gallup polls, for example, every year they ask the question of how biased is the press, and every year you see the perception of bias grow. But particularly, if you're a Bernie Sanders supporter, if you were a Bernie Sanders supporter or a Donald Trump supporter, you particularly thought that the press in this country was not free. And so the point I want to make, excuse me, is that what the US is facing nowadays is something that countries in Latin America have faced for many, many decades, and it's a problem of legitimation. More and more people do not think of institutions as legitimate, and because they don't think of institutions as legitimate, they're willing to take risks. And when they take risks, we have, again, a figure that's familiar for anyone who has been interested in Latin American politics, the figure of El Caudillo, somebody who promises that they and they alone can enact political change. And you will find caudillos in the right, and you will find caudillos in the left. And you will find that for the most part, those caudillos, once they get to power, are not able to deliver on the promises that have got them elected, but rather end up further deinstitutionalizing their country and creating additional problems of legitimacy. And so I want to open it up to questions. My final statement is that we have a lot of work to do in terms of reconstructing the legitimacy of the US political system in order to avoid the temptation of charismatic populist leaders from the left or from the right that, in my opinion, and looking at multiple historical antecedents, tend to make things worse rather than better in terms of a political system. So I'll stop there and I'll open it up for questions. Thank you very much.
And just a reminder, Jackie and I will bring around the mic, so if you could just hold your question until you have the mic so everyone can hear you, that would be great.
I find the survey a bit too general because you're comparing two periods. The first one, of course, is less turmoil. The world stability has gone to pot. That's number one. Number two, as far as the media is concerned, newspapers now are very expensive. Not everyone can purchase one. There is a certain amount of prejudice in newspapers. Now, I remember at the beginning, just prior to the Iraq War. I don't know, what is the percentage of papers who favored the war? Tremendous. Now you need to tell me that they didn't have information, because those who were against the war certainly did.
Okay.
Let's see, I've got I'm getting too old here. Let's see. Well, I'll just
No. So those are great questions. So the first one, comparing two periods has its problems, of course, right? And so when we ask someone, how often do you talk about politics in 1950s, are they answering the same question that we're asking now? And one could say, well, politics meant something different in 1950s than it means now. And so this can be a limitation of this type of study, right? In which the meaning of words, the meaning of concepts evolves. And then you're faced with the tricky methodological choice of using the exact question wording to be able to claim that you're measuring the same thing that they measured, even though the concept might have changed a little, or using a different way of measuring it, but then facing the problem of, well, yeah, but you asked a different question. So every time we compare across cultures and across time, we run into that problem, and that's a clear limitation of any comparative political or psychological or sociological comparison. So I think you're right in terms of saying different moments, and some of these things might mean different things then and now. And I would say, and I have no proof of this other than my opinion, that I can't imagine that it's just a change in the meaning of the words when the shifts are so dramatic in terms of public opinion about certain issues and not on others. And so, for example, when we see things like following the news, talking to others, there we see expected trends and logical similarities. It's when it's about trusting the system or trusting our fellow citizens that the shifts comes into place. So I'll grant you that there's always that risk when you compare over time. I think the third part of your question, price of information and potential media bias. So there's two different problems, both complex. I would say that price is a problem, but maybe a diminishing problem that is replaced by an even bigger problem of skills. So if I have the computer skills, I can be very well informed, right? But of course, to have those computer skills, well, those are not evenly distributed among the population. They're highly skewed by SES and education, right? And so the problem of price, I think, has morphed into a problem of skills, and those skills are fairly clearly class-based, which is very problematic. The third point, I believe, was this idea of media bias and media content. I study media, and I study public opinion about media. And again, here I'm being more, when you look at the actual studies that look at media content and not our perception of media content, you tend to find that the media doesn't do as bad a job as we claim it does. So everybody thinks the media does a terrible job, and you can all find examples of specific stories in which the media got it wrong, in which there's factual inaccuracies. Everybody can find an example. But when you look at thousands, there's colleagues in the journalism school that have done this, computer-assisted content analysis, so coding not one story, but thousands of stories on an election about are they balanced in terms of Republican candidates versus Democratic candidates. And what you find is that the media, for all its faults, tends to do a better job than we give it credit for. And there's an interesting line of research, and if they invite me again, I'll talk to you about this. There's an interesting line of research concerning a topic that's called hostile media phenomena. And I don't know the psychological explanation for this, but for the most part, when we encounter new information, psychologists tell us that we all suffer from a bias, which is we think that that information, that new text that we've discovered, supports what we already believe. And so, for example, if you give a study to people in which there's some evidence that supports that the death penalty is a good deterrent of crime, and some evidence that supports that it's not, and you give it to people who support the death penalty or oppose it, they will both go to the parts that support their argument, and they will say, see, this study proves that my side is right. And psychologists call this an assimilation bias. Interestingly enough, when it comes to news content, the opposite happens. We focus on the parts that do not support our beliefs, and we end up thinking then that media content is hostile to our beliefs, and furthermore, that media content, because it's persuasive, is going to get all those other people on the wrong side of the issue. So I would say, and I think you won't be completely satisfied with my answer, but I will say that the media has not been as bad as we have claimed it to be, with some specific institutional biases. And I'll give you a couple. In the 20th century, the media in this country was official sources prevailed in media. And by official sources, I mean the national government, experts, business people. If you do content analysis of who gets quoted in the media, it might be Republicans, it might be Democrats, but they tended to be either government officials or experts of some kind. So in the 20th century, the media system was somewhat biased to the status quo. And if you were somebody trying to change the status quo, it was harder for you to get your message in mainstream media content. Now we face a very different media environment in which, alongside traditional media, we have all kinds of outlets, from good ones to very bad ones, that propagate information. And so we are changing a system in which editors, who are human beings and make mistakes and have political ideologies, we're making decisions about this should be in the news and this shouldn't. And now we're changing that with a system that's based on our social networks and algorithms. So this story is getting a lot of clicks, and so Facebook starts to pull it up, or Google starts to show it because, there's traffic involved with that story, and they have good reasons to, something that's getting attention, they put it up first, and therefore it gets even more attention, right? And so now we have this algorithmic logic to news, and then your friends and social networks that post something on Facebook, they found a story interesting, they post it on Facebook, and then you start to be exposed, particularly younger people. If you ask a class of freshmen, unlike us, they don't read the newspaper or watch in the morning or watch the news at night. During the day, things pop up, and they go and read that story. And there's all kinds of interesting consequences to that. But I will end my long answer to you by saying, one of the biggest problems with socially curated news is that we tend to pose, and I'm not even talking about deliberately paying someone to produce fake news and put it online. I'm talking about us as citizens. We tend to share news in two types of occasions. There's something that we thought was particularly good, and we share it. But we also share when we think somebody from the other side did something particularly foolish. And so we post it to our Facebook page, for example, and what we're saying is, pardon the language, can you imagine what these idiots are thinking? And so you post it. Now, if you are, let's say you're a liberal, and let's say I'm a liberal, and we're both connected in social media, and I post something about conservatives, and I've selected it because it's the extreme example of a conservative. And you read it, because we're in the same social network. Well, to you, it starts to become that is how conservatives or Republicans or whatever that other group thinks like. Because examples, there's an interesting theory in psychology, exemplification theory. I can tell you 30% of Republicans think this, and then I give you one extreme example of a Republican that thinks something completely out there. The statistic I gave you is not going to matter. It's the example I gave you that's going to matter. So you're going to start thinking about that group based on the example you got. And the example you got, I selected it not as a journalist thinking, what should people know? I precisely selected because I thought it was so foolish that's why I selected it. So those become two big problems of not news production, but news distribution in the 21st century. Was the old system better than the new system? Maybe it's not even worth asking the question in the sense that, well, maybe it was, but we have the system that we have and we live in the system that we live in, right? I don't know if, I tried to answer your questions, but they're very tough ones. If somebody else, and then I'll come back to you.
It seems to me that your approach that we've lost sense of the legitimacy of government, and yet the person that posted that is now head of the government and is using tweets, and all the media now are about tweets. So there seems to be a terrible contradiction here.
Can you elaborate a little bit on where you see the contradiction?
The contradiction is that the person that is no longer, that got elected because the government wasn't legitimate, and even if he lost the election, it would not be legitimate, is now the legitimate person that's in charge of the government.
That's a good point. So I don't see it as a contradiction. I see it as legitimation is in crisis, and so we don't trust the parties, right? So if a political party endorses, so the Republican Party wanted other candidates, but that doesn't matter to me if I don't trust the parties anymore, right? So I don't trust that endorsement. So I think my point is that in a situation like that, in which you don't trust these intermediary institutions, you are going to feel attracted to options that resonate with you. And they might resonate with you more on emotional terms than rational terms. And they might resonate with you because there is real aspects to a situation. What do I mean by that? This crisis of legitimation is not just, oh, I don't trust the government anymore. This crisis of legitimation stems also from, if you look at the data on income inequality since the 70s in this country, it's getting worse. It's getting worse, right? And so if I'm one of those people who I am on the bottom end, my life is not better than my parents' life. And I don't see that my kids are going to have a better life. And so I'm not saying that legitimation is just something that happens mentally. It's based on real issues that are happening on the ground. What I'm suggesting, though, is in that environment in which you don't trust institutions anymore, then you have people that take advantage of that situation saying, well, the government is not legitimate, I'm going to fix this. And you have a Chavez in Venezuela who says, the government is not legitimate. And again, it's not that Venezuela didn't have problems when he was saying this, and there was high levels of inequality in Venezuela, and there had been corruption, and there had been mismanagement. So it's not like this is happening. But in a context like that, I think it becomes easy for someone who promises change to be elected. Of course, I mean, of course, all institutions are promising change, but here it's a change that I think is qualitatively different to what a traditional party would promise in terms of, look, we want to change and this is how we're going to, so we're going to do this, that's going to take us here, that's going to take us here. I think with caudillos it becomes much more of almost a mythical phenomena in which if you elect me, I will provide the change that you need, and I don't even have to tell you how I'm going to do it. It's just I can do it. I can solve the problem. And so I don't see it as a contradiction in terms of, I think in a context like that, caudillos emerge, and so one could think that that's what happened in this election. And I showed, so one of the things that I made emphasis on, if you look at Bernie supporters and Trump supporters, they're more similar than distinct in all of these characteristics, right? So I guess what I'm saying is, apparently we have a caudillo of the right, but we could have had a caudillo on the left. I tend to think that caudillos on the right or on the left are not the most desirable forms of government, but that's an opinion.
We have time for one last question.
But and after that, I had promised her that I would come back to her. So.
I want to follow up with this, accepting that the problem of legitimation exists. Why is the solution the El Caudillo? If you go back to the 19th century, there was anarchy, there was collectivism, socialism, collectivism. Why is it the El Caudillo, the autocrat?
No, again, I'm not suggesting that this is the solution. On the contrary, I'm suggesting that in a context like this, caudillos emerge, and actually they end up increasing the delegitimation of the system, and reducing the institutionality that has been created by a system. And creating institutions is a very hard and complicated thing to do. Trashing institutions is a simpler thing to do, but then recovering them is a very, very hard thing to do. And so I'm not saying this is a solution. On the contrary, I'm saying this is the big dilemma that we face, is how do we come out of this as an option in countries, and here it's not just the US, in countries that do not trust political intermediaries, do not trust political parties, that are more connected to other individuals through social media, but have less of a connection to specific identities or specific institutions. So it's a big challenge. I'm not saying this is the solution, on the contrary. I think this is the threat. Please, can you? And I have to, again, I don't know if, I have more time, but I don't know if we are, so I can stay longer is what I'm saying if there's more questions. Unless they're going to kick us out for some other reason.
Sorry. No, I just want to correct something. I do rely on the media as far as the newspapers are concerned. I don't watch TV. I listen to radio, and they are more looking for issues that encourage responses. They're not very literate and what have you. That's number one. And as far as Trump is concerned, people were disgruntled about both parties, and he didn't seem to belong to either one. That's number two. And number three, I was going to talk about Mexico. Now, I am very ignorant about Mexico, but I have a friend who's a Mexican, and she realized, or she told me that, of course, with the transfer of industries to Mexico, improved their labor conditions. And I'm wondering how many people voted for Hillary on the basis of that particular issue, not knowing the entire picture. Or maybe they did, but I wouldn't, I think I have to be more informed about every country.
You pose an interesting problem, which is, in an era of globalization, so if you, there have been a distribution of rewards globally, but having said that, in most countries in the world, inequality in the last couple of decades has increased. And so if you, going to your Mexican example, thanks to NAFTA, there are some better jobs now in Mexico. And so there's been a redistribution of labor and there's been a redistribution, but unfortunately, I think, this is an editorial comment, unfortunately governments have not been able to manage the inequities that globalization has brought. And so globalization has been great from the perspective of macroeconomics and certain business owners. It's not necessarily great for everybody within a society. And so, again, editorial comment, I think that we need strong governments and able to manage things like globalizations. But I say this fully knowing that we live in an era in which actually people, most people, want to reduce the size of these institutions, right? And so it's like this paradox of, on the one hand, we seem to need strong institutions that deal with these inequities, but at the same time, those institutions become increasingly delegitimized. I'll end with an anecdote. I was doing some research on children and political values in children, and so I interviewed this 8-year-old, son of a liberal professor living in liberal Madison. And I wanted to know what types of questions you could ask an 8-year-old. And so in a survey, so I was asking like, okay, for you, what are taxes? And this 8-year-old kid in a public school in Madison, both parents, professors, says, I don't know what taxes are, but they're bad. And so there's already an emotional connection, and I'm sure that 8 years from now I can interview him again and he'll give me reasons why taxes are bad, right? And this is one of the problems with political science and communication studies, that most of our models have been very rationalistic, when in fact human behavior is also very emotional. And then we can have an emotion, an attitude, and then find the reasons as to why we do what we do. That was, again, a long question. If we have time, I think you wanted to ask a question. Do we have time? Okay.
Well, my question was just that we clearly are in a situation where we have charismatic populist leaders. The is taking down our institutions by so-called judges, fake news, that's what you said. Are there lessons in history where we can learn something from where situations like this have gone on? We used to have some trust in the institutions. What kind of things from history has to happen?
So there's an interesting difference, I think, between some of the countries that I've studied, certain Latin American countries, and the US. And I think it is, the US still has much more robust institutions, right? And so it is, in theory, easier if you're a caudillo in Venezuela to diminish institutional oversight. In theory, in the US, that's more complicated, because institutions are more robust. And so, from a research perspective, it's a very interesting case of, will institutions be strong enough to prevent further deinstitutionalization or not? In that sense, most of this literature on populism and caudillos comes from countries in which institutions were not that robust to begin with. And so that makes the US potentially a very different case. As a citizen, I hope we will be able to show that institutions matter and that they are able to self-correct in ways that other countries have not been able to. So in most Latin American countries, a caudillo is followed by concentration of wealth, concentration of power, until the point where there's an institutional crisis and there's some kind of either popular uprising or the military takes over again because there's too much civil unrest. So hopefully the US institutions will be strong enough to be able to self-correct.
Great. Thank you for all attending.
Thank you.